So off to you, Anna.
Great. So I'm very excited that in a moment we'll be able to hear Dr. Katie Shilton talk about her work. Katie is a prolific and versatile researcher, and she often engages with pressing and practical issues in the area of design and ethics. It certainly doesn't hurt that Katie's papers are really beautifully written. So I often find that when I'm looking for that one perfect paper to help me understand a complex issue in ethics and privacy and design, then it so happens that she's almost always one of the authors on that paper. So I really encourage you to explore her work after the talk. Katie's work looks both at how users interact with technology and the worries and the expectations they have about ethics, but also how designers relate to values in their work. For example, by exploring how designers think about values such as privacy and fairness, what prevents them from designing with these values in mind, and how workplaces may be shaped to make it easier for designers to embed values into the work they do, and to rather than placing that burden on individual professionals. And importantly, Katie's work reminds us that many policy decisions happen while designing a product or a technology, and that technical work is not value neutral. And I will let Katie tell you more about her work.
Anna, thank you. That was an awesome introduction. I'm really pleased to be here and joining you all today. And yeah, one day in person, I hope. So today I'm going to focus, as Anna mentioned, on the ways that we can incorporate ethical reflection directly into the work of digital technology design. In particular, I'm interested in the link between practices, design practices, and ethical reflection. And I found levers to be a useful metaphor to talk about the design practices that sort of pry open questions about values and ethics during technical work. So as my title suggests, I'm going to focus on the how-to today, the practice of ethical concerns like privacy and fairness within technology design. I'm going to start by talking about design in the kind of moment we find ourselves in, which is at least partially defined by what is being termed the Techlash. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got interested in tech ethics at all, and then I'll spend some time talking about ethical concerns that have been at the center of the Techlash. First up will be privacy. I'll talk about why privacy is a problem in digital technology design, some things we might do about it. And I'll talk a bit about fairness, again, why it's a problem and what we might do about it. And then finally, I'm going to suggest ways of finding values levers in your own design practice, and I'll also talk a little bit about what's up next for my work and hopefully open a conversation with all of us. Okay, so I probably don't need to introduce you all to the Techlash, especially the last 2 weeks. We've been watching it really unfold at Facebook. But just in case, there are now regular headlines, podcast episodes, a major motion picture, or really just a Netflix documentary about what are increasingly viewed as the ethical failings of big tech. I'm somebody who studied the tech industry for years, and while I think some of the criticism in the past has lacked nuance, although honestly, the stuff coming out about Facebook is just astounding. Tech is a gigantic and complex industry, but there's no doubt that the industry broadly has struggled with whether and how to talk about its politics, its values, and its social obligations. For example, I'm going to play you a 2017 clip from a 2017 Radio Lab episode called Breaking News about the invention of audio and video tools that can recreate nearly perfect fake audio and increasingly nearly perfect fake video. In this clip, you're going to hear a reporter interviewing a researcher in computer vision at the University of Washington who has created a fake video tool.
Like the timing of you guys making this thing and then this explosion of fake news, like how do you guys think about how it could be used for nefarious purposes?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Again, you're a Kemmelmacher Schlizerman.
I feel like when every technology is developed, then there is this danger of with our technology, you can create fake videos and so on. Or I don't want to call it fake videos, but like to create video from audio, right?
But they are fake videos.
Yeah. But the way that I think about it is that like scientists are doing their job in showing, like inventing the technology and showing it's off. And then we all need to like think about the next steps, obviously. I mean, people should work on that.
So people should work on that, which great, more jobs for me and my students. But in all seriousness, I think the implication that it's not her job to worry about social implications is troubling and sort of evocative of the way things have been in technology research to date. But that interview was conducted in 2017. And I actually think that's important because the rise of artificial intelligence, and specifically the subsection of AI that's fueled by machine learning using data about people, I credit that rise with a lot of the attention that tech ethics is suddenly getting. When I first began working in tech ethics 10, 15 years ago, it was pretty common for technologists, the people that I was studying, to claim that technology was a neutral tool and that it was up to users to do good or bad things with it. This is a point of view that has been critiqued in technology studies for decades. But it was still pretty pervasive within technical fields like software engineering. But now it is really rare to hear somebody claim that machine learning is neutral or that it's without human values. It's become increasingly clear that machine learning in particular reifies existing biases and disparities in the data that it uses. It uses very human data. It replicates human biases. As Ruha Benjamin, the author of Race After Technology, writes, existing social biases are reinforced, yes, but new methods of social control are produced as well. Whenever we hear the promises of tech being extolled, our antennae should pop up and question what all that hype of better, faster, fairer might be hiding and making us ignore. And when bias and inequality come to light, lack of intention to harm is not a viable alibi. So how do we avoid crises of inattention, of producing new forms of social control and inequality? This is a question I've been trying to answer my entire career. I did not set out to work in tech ethics. Anna and I were actually just discussing this before I started. I went back to graduate school for a master's degree and to be an archivist and to work with paper. I was really interested in questions of social memory. But along the way in that program, I got involved with a group of faculty who were asking questions not just about memory, which is what I thought I was concerned with, but also about forgetting. They realized that more and more data was being recorded about us. This was 2007-ish, right before the smartphone era. And they realized that there might be negative social ramifications of all of this recording of data about people. And then I was lucky enough while I was at UCLA to join a research center called SENS, the Center for Embedded Network Sensing, which is kind of a mouthful. But SENS leaders were some of the first computer scientists using mobile phones to collect data about people. This was, as I mentioned, before the era of smartphones. And the image here on the right that you can see is actually the setup that we would use in the early days. It's a GPS device and it's taped, it's literally with tape stuck to a Nokia feature phone. And not shown, but in this bag here is the huge battery pack that was required to power this rig for a full day. And then, of course, about a year or two into this research, the first iPhone was released and everything changed. So SENS, the center, became the setting for my dissertation work. I did a participant observation study of how the SENS engineers were grappling with the ethics of the data collections that they were performing. And so this is a picture of grad school me wearing my 2007 bootcut jeans, helping out with a design workshop. Next to me, you can actually see a homemade air quality monitoring device. They were doing lots of different kinds of sensing in this lab, but cell phones were one of the kinds. And from this ethnographic work with sensing engineers came an organizing concept that has shaped a lot of my work going forward, that of values levers. Values levers are work practices or design practices, things that engineers do every day, things that designers do every day, that surface ethical issues within technical work or make particular human values relevant to design. These are aha moments when ethical issues become relevant to technical work. So practices, for instance, like interpreting policy, existing policy in the design context. At SENS, this took the form of dealing with IRB requirements, which is our ethics review boards. And it was having to deal with these external requirements, or what they considered to be external requirements, that surfaced values and values tensions, because the developers had to negotiate design decisions to satisfy those policies. And I would see this again later in my career, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Engaging with users was, and for folks like you, this is not going to be a surprise. Engaging with users also frequently surfaces human values, which is no surprise to anybody who's done participatory design. I think it's one of the reasons why participatory design has been sort of on the forefront of ethical design, because working with users tends to surface values. And there are particular design methods, such as envisioning cards, design fictions, design noir, that can be effective values levers as well. So with my students at UMD, I formed the Ethics and Values in Design Lab, we call it EVID, to try and guide technology design so that human values are as much a part of the process as values like speed and efficiency. I'm going to talk a little bit more about values levers in different software engineering contexts, different design contexts that me and my students have studied, mobile application design specifically, and machine learning data curation, because I think it's helpful for finding structural interventions to introduce justice conversations, ethics and justice conversations into technology design. The point of values levers is that doesn't rely on a single individual to do good design, to be a good person and do good design, but hopefully rather sets up workplaces to encourage these conversations. I think, something has become clear from the Facebook whistleblowers. It's that, these conversations need to be had at a workplace level. Individuals notice these problems all the time, but how do you have these conversations at a workplace? How do you get leadership invested? And that's a big question I'll talk a bit about going forwards. Okay, so what do values levers look like in practice? I've studied a variety of technology workplaces over the years, embedded sensing, network architecture, which is like very low level technical stuff, to try to understand what values levers look like. So first I'm going to talk about, as an example, a collaboration with my collaborator, Dan Green, who's also at the University of Maryland. And we studied levers that encourage privacy discussions in mobile application development. Privacy is one of the first values that tends to surface when people start talking about digital technology. Companies like Clearview AI, which is a facial recognition startup, have been accused of nightmare privacy policies. Recent attempts at contact tracing during the coronavirus pandemic have been stymied by privacy concerns. The public is gun shy about privacy, and for pretty good reason. So then this question comes up, what do developers and designers do about this? And I was really interested in mobile app developers because they are a group that have a lot of leverage to make ethical decisions about what data to collect, how long to keep it, and how to share it. I became curious about when and how they talk about and debate that power. So for our study, we turned to two online forums, iPhone Dev SDK and XDA. iPhone Dev SDK is an Apple forum, and XDA is a Google developer forum. And because many developers work alone or on small teams, they tend to seek advice from each other. And online forums is one place where they do that. XDA is a gigantic forum. It's really big. It is for Android developers and users. You see both developers and users there, which is kind of cool. We chose it for its popularity and also its independence from Google. It's not run by Google. iPhone Dev SDK is a smaller forum for iOS developers, and it is the largest iOS forum that is not run by Apple. There is a larger one, but it's run by Apple. We wanted ones that were independent. The method we used to analyze the threads in these forums was something called critical discourse analysis. And critical discourse analysis analyzes the way that participants talk about their practices. So we couldn't see them doing development in person, but we used the way they talk about their development to try to get at their practices. And in particular, it puts an emphasis on analyzing power and agency and asking questions about how people justify and legitimize their practices, right? Why do they think what they're doing is the right thing to do? We sampled threads talking about privacy from these forums, and we did this in 2015. And we looked for patterns and themes, including how developers talk about users, the data types that they were talking about, location, images. Phones can collect a huge variety of data types, GPS, things like that, and decisions. And we looked at their discussions about their decisions to collect, retain, and share data. And what we found was that for iOS developers, Apple developers, navigating Apple's application store process was the single most common trigger for data discussions. Developers wrote into the forum, Apple developers, when their app was rejected from the App Store, which happened surprisingly frequently, or when they got frustrated or simply had trouble interpreting Apple's policies. The power of Apple's regulations also manifested in their technical constraints. When iOS developers couldn't access data that they wanted, like turning on the camera without telling the user, the iOS platform does not allow developers to do that. And they would find that technical constraint and they would write in and say, how do I get around this? And then other people would inform them, you can't get around that, that's a privacy violation. So Apple did a ton of work in defining privacy for iOS developers. Apple has a pretty strict set of standards for its developers, and interpreting that policy became the primary values lever for iOS developers. Things were really different on the Android side. Android developers did not, at the time, face the same policy constraints around data collection as that imposed by Apple. This has changed a bit since 2015, but at the time, Google had a very open policy for what its developers could and couldn't do. And as a result, there was far less discussion of privacy issues on FDA. It just came up less on XDA. It came up much less than it did. It came up all the time on iOS because people were constantly trying to navigate iOS policy. But when there were data ethics discussions, when there were privacy discussions, they were frequently triggered by user concerns because users were much more of a presence on the XDA platform. So users and developers, and also there's a lot of overlap in an open source ecosystem between users and developers. Users are developers and vice versa. So those user conversations were much richer on XDA, and users would request new data protection features of particular developers. They would critique the permissions that various apps ask for, and in response, developers would implement more restrictive data policies. So the open source environment encouraged these kinds of back and forth design discussions. And that was a very powerful values lever in the XDA universe. Okay, shifting away from mobile apps for a moment and privacy, I want to talk about another human values concern that's very salient at the moment and that folks have been hearing a lot about: fairness. There have been a range of public examples in the last 5 years, plus some really important academic work that have highlighted the ways in which AI learns bias and discrimination from the data that fuels it. Parole algorithms, automatic image cropping, learning chatbots, HR tools, ad delivery, image search have all been impacted by the use of historical data, which has historical biases built in. For example, Amazon built a recruiting tool that it was using internally, it was testing internally, that learned to discriminate against people who had women's colleges and women's social organizations on their resumes, because this data had been trained on the resumes the company had already received for software engineering positions, resumes that had historically come from men. Amazon scrapped the tool when they discovered this, but that problem was persistent because of the data they'd used to train it. And so how do we encourage the kind of reflection on data that spotting and mitigating bias requires? So I have worked with a doctoral student, Karen Boyd, who was very interested in this question, and she worked on it for her dissertation. And in particular, she was interested in how machine learning engineers grapple with bias in training data sets that they didn't create. So frequently in machine learning, engineers are working with data sets that they've gotten from other places. They didn't collect that data themselves. And she was interested in how they interpret problems in data that they've sort of inherited. Data sharing is super common in machine learning. A group of machine learning engineers, prominent machine learning engineers, including Tanit Gabru, who you might have heard of, had previously proposed in 2018 that training data sets should come with something called data sheets. These are a document which specifies the motivation, composition, collection process, and recommended uses of a data set. And the authors make an analogy to the spec sheets that accompany electronic devices, so that you sort of know how to use them properly and know how they might interact with other devices. The data should perhaps come with such a spec sheet as well. So Karen was really interested in this idea of data sheets for data sets, and she conducted a think aloud comparison study in which she gave machine learning engineers who she'd recruited a problematic data set. She gave them a data set of faces that appeared to be overwhelmingly white and male. And in addition, she specified that the images she gave them a data set that specified, a data sheet that specified that the images had been taken without explicit consent of the people that they represented. And she then gave all of her participants a machine learning problem to solve with that data. She told them that they needed to think about how to build a facial recognition system for a national jewelry chain that was trying to do loss prevention efforts. So, and then she also gave half of her participants a data sheet that described the motivation, composition, collection process, and recommended uses of the data. What she found as she asked these engineers to think aloud as they started thinking through what they would need to build such a system, she found that the data sheets helped trigger recognition of ethical issues and signal that ethics was relevant to their task, that is something that they should be thinking about. Of the participants that had data sheets, the vast majority mentioned ethical issues in the data unprompted. So, she would walk them through this exercise, and they would mention the ethical issues on their own. While the ML engineers without data sets did recognize at least one ethical issue when she directly prompted them afterwards during a follow-up interview, most of the engineers with data sheets who read it, there was one exception of a person who got a data sheet but didn't read it, but everybody who read their data sheets identified one or more ethical issues on their own and tied it in with their technical work during the talk aloud exercise. And in addition, data sheets particularly supported engineers in a process called particularization, which is figuring out what to do about an ethical issue once you've spotted it. So for example, this quote comes from a participant as they actively read the context document and recognize that the demographics of the data would likely reflect the demographics of the platform that the data were taken from. So where's it from? PhotoBucket. Okay, so whatever the demographics are for PhotoBucket, that's what I can expect in here. So this engineer recognized that the data might have biases, saying, quote, that could introduce errors in the data set, biases. So using context documents as a concrete values lever for engineers to spot and problem solve around ethical issues. Okay, so what might these patterns mean for design professionals who are interested in increasing the space for ethical discussions in their own work? I encourage everyone working in design spaces to reflect on where they might introduce values levers in their own practice, in their own workplaces. For example, designers can be attentive to the policies that surround data collection in their context. You can look for the increasing number of federal or local laws that might apply to data collection in your context. But perhaps more importantly, I think you can scaffold design in your setting with organizational policy, what I refer to as little p policy, like Apple's policy for mobile developers. Requiring things like privacy impact assessments for particular forms of data collection could be an example of an organizational policy towards data that would serve as a lever. Second, I recommend thinking a bit about what the technical constraints are in the ecosystem or infrastructures that you're working on. Is there something your team wants to do that is surprisingly difficult? And are there social or socio-technical reasons that that might be the case? Spotting technical constraints is often a sign of a bigger social problem. If something is hard to do, there might be social reasons as well as technical reasons why that is. And lastly, I always encourage you to do something that I think many designers are increasingly expert in, especially in the HCI space, which is incorporating the voices and concerns of users in design. This is one of the single most important things we can do to increase discussions of values in design. There are values levers for design professionals who are interested in increasing attention and space for fairness discussions in their work. First, take all the measures, if you are collecting data, take all the measures you can to preserve, understand, and perhaps even critique the context in which training data is collected. Make sure you understand what's in the data for the systems you're using. That unpacking and interrogation of the data itself is so important, and everything we can do to preserve metadata about that data, the context of that data, is critically important. And in particular, look for and be attentive to historical biases in your context. We have to encourage designers to understand historic and systemic bias because it is increasingly popping up in systems. This is frequently around categories like race and gender, for example, or also language. Language is another huge place where this kind of bias comes into systems. And that we need to document and be aware of those kinds of biases in data sets that we're using. And so finally, knowing where to turn for guidance. If you haven't been trained in this stuff, that's fine. We understand that much technical education has, lacked a history of social equity, for instance, but there is great guidance now for people who are interested in finding out more about this, for mitigating biases and working towards justice in design work. There are numerous helpful frameworks for thinking through issues of power that are specifically adapted for diverse and varied forms of digital data, including feminism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and queer theory. There's work in all of those areas that directly applies to data. I've just put a few sites down here, places to get started, but there's a lot of wonderful stuff out there. I think these frameworks can provide really concrete guidance for designers considering how data biases and unfairness might impact their design and their technologies. So my sort of takeaway recommendation for you is, this is very cheesy, but ABC, always be contexting. We know that design is never just a technical problem, but a socio-technical one. And it includes policy environments, both big P and little p, that your project will launch into. It might include spotting real-world constraints that will make deployment difficult or problematic, and it might include increasing user representation and design to ensure that user voices aren't and concerns aren't forgotten. And finally, it might mean being attuned to biases in training data, or at least helping data scientists start conversations about potential biases. Sarita Amroot uses the term attunement to talk about how technical workers need to be increasingly considerate of the ways their technologies play out in networks of power and marginality. And I like that idea of attunement, right, of sort of being sensitive to it so that you can find the right people to talk about it when you spot it. Okay, and I wanted to sort of end with what I'm thinking about and what's next, because I would love to have a conversation about where your work is going and where mine might go next. The Techlash is really changing the conversation about values and ethics within tech design as a whole. And at the same time, we have a host of new degree programs. It's not just computer science programs anymore training technical workers. We have social data science, information design programs. And these programs are all making changes to technical education and to the values and ethics and explicit justice issues that are increasingly integrated into these programs. But I think we have a big, hard question, which is, are companies where designers work ready for these changes? The work of values and ethics advocacy in tech contexts is hard. My collaborators, Jake Metcalf and Emmanuel Moss, have conducted interviews with who they call the ethics owners, which are the people who have been hired into big tech companies to deal with ethics challenges. They report intense structural resistance to change, due largely to the market realities of how tech is developed. The recent Facebook whistleblowers have demonstrated this too, right? Individual workers are noticing tech problems, leadership is not listening, or ethics problems, leadership isn't listening. So how do we prepare students to do values work and also succeed in tech workplaces? I think this is a really hard problem, and I'm still puzzling over how to do this well. And I'm considering things like maybe cohort studies of recent graduates, or perhaps comparative studies of different program graduates, perhaps in different contexts, different national contexts. And it's something I'd like to talk more about with folks like you, folks who are also headed out into this world. How do we prepare tech workers well for the new realities of tech work? So I'm going to leave it here, wrap up with a link to my project websites. My email address is here in case we don't get to chat and you'd like to follow up. But now I would love to open it up, take questions, and have a discussion.